This necklace has been in our family for generations.
It's so delicate. It was your great-grandmother's.
It's beautiful.
I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me at a party was spilling wine on a borrowed dress. I found out otherwise on a Saturday in November, under a chandelier that cost more than my grandmother's shop made in a decade, in front of 300 people who all watched a woman named Yuna reach for my throat and call it a compliment to my husband. Before I was Naomi Choi in the society pages, a name I never asked for and never quite got used to. I was just Naomi from Carter Estate and Appraisal, the little shop on Fenwick Street that my grandmother Odessa built with her own 2 hands out of a pawn counter and 40 years of never lying to anybody about what their things were worth. I inherited the shop. I did not inherit a taste for chandeliers. I got both anyway, the day I married Jae-hoon Choi. Jae-hoon was not a man people described as warm. Board members flinched when he walked into a room. Rival shipping executives had learned, the expensive way, not to be late to meetings with him. He ran Choi Holdings the way his father had built it fast, ruthless, and with a set of unspoken rules everyone on the outside pretended not to notice. But none of that ever touched me. With me, he was slow, careful. He asked before he touched my hair. He learned, without being told, that I needed 30 seconds of silence before I could answer a hard question, and he gave it to me every time, even when a room full of men in suits was waiting on him to move. Fierce to the world, quiet with me. That was the deal, and I never doubted it. Not once, not even the night everything came apart. I wore one piece of jewelry, every day, rain or shine, black tie or blue jeans, a thin gold chain with a small, plain ring soldered onto it as a pendant. It wasn't valuable. I'd had it appraised myself, professionally, the year I turned 25 18-carat gold, unremarkable cut, worth maybe $400 at auction. Nothing that would turn heads in Jae-hoon's world. It had come to me in a shoebox of unclaimed pieces after my grandmother died. One ring among dozens that she'd never sold off even after their legal hold periods expired, because Odessa Carter did not believe some things were really pawned. She believed they were held. I didn't know why that particular ring had mattered enough for her to keep separate from the rest, in its own little velvet pouch, for 30-some years. I just knew it had, and that was enough for me to wear it like a piece of her. I did not know that Saturday in November that I was also wearing a piece of the man I'd married. Neither did he. That was the whole problem. We'd met, if you're wondering, at my own shop counter, not the meet-cute the tabloids eventually invented, where a Mafia prince supposedly swept a shopgirl off her feet, but something slower and less photogenic. He'd come in alone, no security, no entourage, to have a cufflink appraised that had belonged to his father. And instead of talking down to me the way most men in expensive suits did when they walked into Carter Estate and Appraisal for the first time, he asked me questions and actually waited for the answers. He came back twice more that month with nothing to appraise at all. By the 3rd visit, I understood he wasn't there for the cufflinks. What nobody in his family's circle ever seemed to grasp was that the version of Jae-hoon Choi they feared in boardrooms and the version who sat across my kitchen island every night were, as far as I was concerned, the more honest and less honest halves of the exact same man. Fierce was the armor. Careful was underneath it. I had married the second one, and I had spent 14 months watching his family act as though I'd somehow tricked him into it, as though a man that dangerous couldn't possibly have chosen gentleness on purpose. I should say, before I go further, that this wasn't the first time Yuna had tried to make me small. It was only the first time she'd done it with her hands. 3 months into the marriage, at a smaller dinner, she'd asked me, in front of Jae-hoon's cousins, whether I'd always known how to use a proper wine glass, or whether that was something you had to learn. 6 months in, she sent me an article about marrying up gracefully, unsigned, forwarded from an account with no name attached, though everyone at that table knew whose perfume was on it. I never told Jae-hoon about most of it. I told myself I was choosing my battles. Looking back, I think I was doing what my grandmother did for 40 years behind that pawn counter, cataloguing quietly, writing things down in a ledger only I could see, waiting to understand the whole shape of a thing before deciding what to do about it. The gala was the Choi Family Foundation's autumn benefit, held every year in the ballroom of a hotel Jae-hoon's father used to own outright before he sold half of it to launder something I was better off not asking about. I had been Jae-hoon's wife for 14 months. In that time, His family had made their opinion of me clear in the specific, bloodless way old money families excel at not insults, just omissions. My name left off gift tags. My chair moved 6 inches farther from the head of the table at every dinner, an inch at a time, so gradually I told myself I was imagining it until I measured it once and wasn't. And there was Yuna Baik, who had grown up 2 doors down from the Chawls in Seoul, who Jae-hoon's grandmother called the daughter I should have gotten, who had somehow, despite Jae-hoon marrying someone else entirely, never actually left. Yuna found me by the champagne fountain 40 minutes into the gala, in a green dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage, holding a flute she wasn't drinking from. Naomi. She said my name like she was trying out a word in a language she didn't respect. I love that necklace. Is it from somewhere? Local? It was my grandmother's, I said. I kept my voice even. I have found, in 14 months of these rooms, that composure is the only currency Yuna Baik can't outbid. How sentimental. Her eyes went to my throat and stayed there a beat too long. You know, the Choi family has actual archives, museum-quality pieces. Jae-hoon's mother's collection alone, she made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh. It just seems like such a waste, doesn't it? Him standing next to real history, and you wearing a pawn shop's leftovers. Around us, the party kept moving a string quartet working through something classical and forgettable. Waiters threading trays of hors d'oeuvres between clusters of people whose net worth I could have appraised more accurately than their manners. Jae-hoon was 30 feet away, cornered by 2 board members and a man from a shipping conglomerate I recognized from the financial pages, laughing at something with the particular tightness he only used in rooms he had to be gracious in. He hadn't seen us yet. Yuna had chosen her moment well. She always did. I didn't answer. I have learned that silence unnerves people like Yuna far more than a comeback does. It unnerved her enough that she reached out, fast, and closed her fingers around the chain at my neck. "Let me see it properly," she said, and pulled. The clasp didn't just open. It snapped cheap solder, giving way under a sharp enough yank, and the chain came free in her hand while the little ring flew loose and hit the marble floor with a sound too small for a room that large to have gone as silent as it did. Champagne flutes stopped mid-air. A photographer's flash went off, then another. I stood there with my hand at my bare throat, and for 1 full second the only thing in my body was the specific, total stillness of humiliation, the kind where you can hear your own pulse and nothing else. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I bent down, slowly, deliberately, the way my grandmother taught me to move when the whole room is watching and waiting for you to fall apart, and picked the ring up off the floor myself. If you've ever had someone try to shrink you down to nothing in a room full of people who all just watched it happen and said nothing, drop your city in the comments. I want to know how many of us there are. That's when Jae-hoon reached us. I heard him before I saw him, the particular hush that moved through a crowd whenever he crossed it, faster than usual this time. I expected him to go for Yuna. I expected fury, the kind I'd only ever seen him aim at boardrooms and rivals, never at me, never near me. Instead, he went completely still. He was looking at the ring in my palm. Not at me. Not at Yuna, still standing there with a broken gold chain draped over her fingers like she'd caught a fish. At the ring. His face did something I had never once seen it do in 14 months of marriage. It went young, stripped down. For half a second, my husband, the man boardrooms flinched for, looked like a boy. "Where?" he said, and his voice came out wrong, cracked in the middle. "Did you get that?" "It was my grandmother's," I said again, because it was the only true thing I had. "I don't know where she got it. I've had it since I was 25. He held out his hand. I gave him the ring. He turned it over once, twice, his thumb finding some worn place on the inside of the band that I'd never noticed in 11 years of wearing it. And when he looked up at me, his eyes were wet in a way that made the entire glittering room disappear for both of us. "This was my mother's wedding ring," he said. "She's been dead for 31 years. I have spent most of my adult life looking for this ring, and I never told a single person, because I didn't want anyone to know how much it would hurt if I never found it. Nobody in that ballroom knew what to do with that. Least of all Yuna, whose face had gone the colour of the tablecloths. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to everything that came after. In that moment, I didn't understand what I'd just been handed. I thought it was a strange, sad coincidence, the kind that makes for good dinner conversation for a year and then fades. I did not yet understand that a woman with a green dress and a talent for cruelty had just, without meaning to, ripped the one loose thread that would eventually unravel her entire life. We left the gala 20 minutes later. Jae-hoon didn't speak in the car. He held the ring in his closed fist the whole ride home like he was afraid it would vanish if he let air touch it. And when we got inside our apartment, he sat at the kitchen island until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at nothing, while I made tea neither of us drank and waited for him to be ready to talk. My mother pawned it, he finally said, not looking up. It has to be. That's the only way it ends up in your grandmother's shop. My father always told me she lost it, or that it was stolen. He changed the story depending on his mood, which should have told me something. His jaw worked. We were not always the Choi of the foundation gala, Naomi. My father built all of this out of nothing, and somewhere underneath nothing is a version of my mother desperate enough to pawn her own wedding ring, and he has spent 31 years making sure nobody remembers that part. Do you want to find out what happened? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. Do you? I thought about my grandmother, and her 40 years of never selling what she believed still belonged to somebody. I thought about a velvet pouch kept separate from the rest for 3 decades, in a shop that couldn't afford sentiment and kept it anyway. I think, I said, my grandmother already answered that question. We just have to go find out what she said. The ledgers were in the shop's back room, in the same steel filing cabinets Odessa Carter had used since 1987, organized by year in her small, careful handwriting, a habit she'd drilled into me before I could legally drive. Write down everything, because someday somebody's dignity is going to depend on you having proof. There were 34 years of them, bound in matching grey binders, each one smelling faintly of the cedar blocks she used to keep the moths out. I started with the year Jae-hoon guessed his mother might have come through a rough window, since he had only a photograph and a birth year to work from, and worked backward and forward from there, 1 page at a time, under a desk lamp that had been buzzing since before I was born. Jae-hoon came every night after the gala. He never asked to help search. He seemed to understand, without my saying it, that this was my grandmother's handwriting and my grandmother's system, and that I needed to be the one to find it. He sat on the customer stool across the counter instead, still in his suit from whatever meeting had run late, saying almost nothing, watching me turn pages the way a man watches a door he's been standing outside of for 31 years. It took me 2 full days after the gala, working after hours with the shop's lights low, and Jae-hoon sitting silently across the counter like he was afraid to breathe too loud, before I found the entry. March 14th, 32 years ago. Item, 18K gold wedding band, minor engraving. Client, Naomi Choi. Loan issued, $340. And in the margin, in Odessa's own hand, 4 words that made Jae-hoon put his head down on the counter and stay there a long time, told her no rush. Below it, a second note, dated 8 months later, in different ink. Never came back. Some things aren't really pawned, just held. I told Jae-hoon what I knew about the woman in that ledger only in fragments, because that was all the ledger gave me: a name, an amount, a date, and my grandmother's private conviction that this particular customer deserved more patience than the shop's own survival technically allowed. Jae-hoon filled in the rest, in pieces, over the following weeks, the way people do when they're finally allowed to say things out loud that they've been carrying alone for decades. His mother, Choi Min-ah, had come to this country with nothing but a husband working 3 jobs and a baby on the way. There had been a bad winter, a hospital bill, a landlord who didn't care about circumstances. She had pawned her ring to survive it, fully intending to reclaim it the moment things turned around, and things did turn around, spectacularly, permanently, less than 2 years later, when Jae-hoon's father made the deal that built the foundation of everything Choi Holdings would eventually become. By then, Min-ah was pregnant again, and sick in a way nobody caught early enough, and she died 11 months after Jae-hoon was born, never having gone back to a small shop on Fenwick Street to reclaim $400 worth of gold that meant more to her than anything the family would go on to own. He told me, one night, about the single photograph he had of her, a small, creased picture his father hadn't known he'd kept. tucked inside the lining of an old jacket Jae-hoon had taken from storage as a teenager for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself. In it, his mother stood outside a restaurant that didn't exist anymore, laughing at something outside the frame, her left hand resting against her stomach where he assumed, doing the math, he must have already been growing. You couldn't see the ring clearly in the photo. He'd spent years squinting at it anyway. "I used to ask my father about her," he said. "When I was young enough that it was still allowed. He'd give me one sentence and change the subject. She loved this city. She worked hard. She would have been proud of you. Nothing that made her a person instead of a headstone." He turned the ring over once more in his fingers. I stopped asking sometime around 15, because I understood, even then, that every question I asked cost him something he didn't want to pay. I didn't know until the gala that what he didn't want to pay was the truth. "My father erased her," Jae-hoon said to me, quietly, on the 3rd week of learning this. Not out of cruelty, out of shame. He couldn't stand for anyone to know we came from a woman who had to pawn her own wedding ring to keep us fed, so he built a story instead. Old family, old money. Nothing so undignified as struggle anywhere in it. He looked at the ring, which he now kept in his jacket pocket at all times, close to his chest. "And my grandmother has spent 30 years helping him tell it. She likes the story better than she likes the truth. I think that's why she's always preferred Yuna to you. Yuna fits the story. You're a reminder that the story isn't real." I didn't say anything to that, but I filed it away, the same careful way my grandmother had filed away $400 and a name in 1994, because a thing filed away carefully is a thing you can find again when you need it. The thing about being underestimated your entire professional life is that eventually you stop minding it, because you notice what it lets you get away with. I had spent 14 months in Choi family circles being introduced, at best, as Jae-hoon's wife. She has a little antiques business, a description so small it made my grandmother's 40 years of expertise sound like a hobby. Nobody in that world thought to ask what little antiques business actually meant that I held the same accreditation as appraisers who worked Sotheby's floor, that I had spent 6 years training under a woman who'd spent 30 years training under my grandmother, that I could look at a piece of jewelry or porcelain for 11 seconds and tell you, with real confidence, whether it was telling the truth about what it was. I remember the exact moment I understood how completely that world had decided not to see me. It was early on, at a foundation planning meeting Jae-hoon had asked me to sit in on, back before any of this started. A board member, a pleasant, silver-haired man named Preston who chaired the acquisitions committee, had spent 40 minutes explaining, slowly and with great patience, what a provenance document was, apparently under the impression that little antiques business meant I sold vintage lamps out of a strip mall. I let him finish. I thanked him. I did not correct him, because I had already learned, by then, that correcting a man like Preston in front of a room cost me more socially than it gained me practically. And my grandmother had taught me to spend social capital the way she spent shop capital carefully, and only when it would actually buy something. It bought something, eventually. Every person in that world who had decided I was harmless, decorative, a hobbyist married in over her head, was a person who never once thought to double-check my credentials before I stood up at a podium with a UV lamp and told 600 of them what they were actually bidding on. Yuna built her authority out of confidence and clothing. I built mine, quietly, out of being underestimated long enough that nobody was watching closely when I stopped being harmless and started being thorough. Yuna Baik, on the other hand, was never underestimated. She was, by the Choi family's own account, an expert the Choi Foundation's unofficial heritage curator, a title she'd given herself 2 years earlier and that nobody had ever bothered to verify, because she said it with enough confidence and wore expensive enough clothes that confidence and clothing had simply been accepted as credentials. She sourced pieces for the Foundation's annual charity auction. She wrote the little placards that told donors what they were bidding on and why it mattered. She had, over 3 years, built a specific kind of authority in that world, the kind built entirely out of other people's assumption that someone that comfortable in a room must know what she's talking about. I started paying attention to her placards purely by accident, the week after the Ledger discovery, while helping the Foundation's events coordinator catalogue donated items for the upcoming Winter Gala, a favour Jae-hoon's grandmother had actually approved. Mostly, I suspect, because she assumed cataloguing was menial work suitable for the appraisal girl. I found a small celadon-glazed bowl in the donation inventory with a placard in Yuna's handwriting, dating it to the early Joseon dynasty and valuing it at $85,000. I picked it up, out of habit more than suspicion, and turned it toward the light. The glaze was wrong. Not obviously wrong, wrong in the specific, technical way that takes 6 years of training to notice. A crackling pattern too uniform, too even, the kind you get from a kiln built in the last 100 years, not 500. I set it down and didn't say anything to anyone. But I opened a new file in my head, right next to the one labeled "Told Her No Rush," and I started writing things down the way my grandmother taught me. Over the following 6 weeks, I did what I do professionally, quietly, without telling Jae-hoon more than the barest outline, because I did not yet know if I was seeing a pattern or seeing what I wanted to see out of 30 seconds of resentment by a champagne fountain. I photographed 11 more pieces from the Foundation's donation archive under the guise of routine, cataloguing a jade bangle dated to the Goryeo dynasty, a set of brass ritual vessels supposedly recovered from a temple site, a lacquered document box, Yuna's placard, tied directly to an 18th century royal workshop. Each one had a story. Each story had a dollar figure attached to it, and the dollar figures were never modest. I sent the images, no names, no context, just measurements and close-up photographs of glaze, grain, and joinery to an old mentor of mine, Marcus Webb, who'd spent 22 years authenticating Asian ceramics and metalwork for 2 major auction houses before retiring to consult privately out of a converted garage in Connecticut. Marcus and I had a rule from my training years. He never told me what he thought I wanted to hear, and I never asked him to. He called me back 4 days later. "Where did you get these?" he said, without a hello. "Does it matter?" "It might, depending on what you're planning to do about it." A pause, papers shuffling on his end. "Naomi, 6 of these are 20th century reproductions. Good ones, somebody with real taste and a real budget picked them out. This isn't flea market fakery." The jade bangle is the worst of it. Whoever's dating that piece to the Goryeo dynasty either doesn't know what they're looking at or is counting on nobody else knowing either. I could hear him take his glasses off, the small click of them folding. If these valuations were used to solicit donor pledges or written into tax documentation anywhere, you're not looking at a mistake anymore. You're looking at fraud. And if you're the one who found it, you need to decide right now how much of your own name you're willing to put behind proving it, because half measures on something like this tend to get the messenger blamed before the fraud. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything about it. Here is the truth about a cascade. My grandmother used to say, every hard thing you ever do gets easier once you've already done the first small piece of it, and the first small piece, for me, was simply this. I kept cataloguing. I kept photographing. I built, piece by piece, the same kind of ledger my grandmother had built for 40 years, the kind where you write everything down because someday somebody's dignity is going to depend on you having proof. 6 pieces became 9. 9 became 14, once Marcus helped me cross-reference against auction records going back years. Records that showed the same handful of family heirloom pieces surfacing at Choi Foundation events with wildly inflated valuations, then quietly disappearing from public record after the gala closed and the donor pledges were collected. 2 weeks into building the file, Yuna cornered me again this time in the foundation office itself, on a Thursday afternoon when she clearly hadn't expected me to still be there. I was photographing the lacquered document box when she walked in. "You're spending a lot of time with our donation archive," she said, setting her bag down like she owned the room, which, in every way that mattered to her, she believed she did. For someone who doesn't really understand this world, cataloguing is cataloguing, I said, not looking up from the box. Doesn't matter which world it's in. I heard you called someone about the jade bangle. Her voice stayed light, but her eyes had gone sharp, tracking. An old auction house contact. Marcus somebody. I did look up at that. I let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to, the way I had at the champagne fountain, because I had learned by then that Yuna filled silence with more information than she meant to give away, every single time. "If you have a question about one of the pieces," I said finally, "you can ask me directly. I'm an accredited appraiser. It's what I do. I know what you do." The light left her voice entirely. "You appraise things nobody important cares about. In a shop on a street, nobody important visits. Don't confuse a hobby for a threat, Naomi. Whatever you think you're building, It isn't going to change what Jae-hoon's family already knows about you. Maybe not, I said, but it might change what they know about you. I watched something flicker across her face, not fear yet, not quite, but the first thin crack of it, the recognition that the woman she'd spent 14 months treating as harmless had just said something with weight behind it. She recovered fast. She always did. Careful, she said, gathering her bag. You're new to this family. I've spent my whole life in it. People believe what they've already decided to believe, and this family decided a long time ago what to believe about me. They decided a long time ago what to believe about a lot of things, I said. Doesn't make all of it true. She left without another word. I finished photographing the document box, logged it in my file next to the others, and did not tell Jae-hoon about the conversation for another week. Not because I was hiding it, but because I understood, watching her walk out, that I had just moved from gathering evidence to something closer to a countdown, and I wanted to be sure of my footing before I told him the clock had started. Yuna, meanwhile, did not slow down. If anything, my new silence around her made her bolder. She began referring to me, in front of Jae-hoon's family, as sweet. But she really doesn't understand this world, a phrase she used so often it started to feel like a title. At a Christmas dinner 3 weeks later, 12 of us around a table set with more silver than my grandmother's shop had appraised in a year, Yuna suggested, in front of everyone, that perhaps I should stick to what you know, small pieces, local things, while she handled anything of real significance for the foundation. She said it warmly, smiling, the kind of comment built to sound like generosity if anyone ever played it back. I heard you've been down in the archive room a lot lately, she added, turning her wine glass by the stem. Cataloguing, was it? I do hope you're not getting in over your head with anything. Some of those pieces are worth more than people realize. You'd know, I said, better than anyone. A small laugh went around the table, the kind that could have meant nothing, and Jae-hoon's hand found my knee under the tablecloth and stayed there. Choi So-yeon laughed too, a small, approving sound she almost never made in my direction. Yuna understands our family's legacy, she said, patting Yuna's hand where it rested near the centerpiece. She understands what we are. I sometimes worry, Naomi, that you don't fully understand what you married into. I understand it a great deal, Halmoni, I said, using the word for the first time at that table, watching it land somewhere behind her eyes she hadn't expected me to reach. I understand it's a family that survived a great deal to get where it is. I have a lot of respect for that kind of survival. I let my gaze move, briefly, deliberately, to Yuna. I think it deserves to be told accurately. Don't you? So-yeon's smile thinned, though I don't think anyone else at the table caught the shift. Yuna did. I watched her catch it, and I watched her decide, in real time, not to ask what I meant. I understood exactly what I'd married into. I understood it better than anyone at that table, including the woman across from me holding hands with a matriarch whose entire preferred version of the family's history depended on nobody looking too closely at either its ceramics or its origins. I just wasn't ready to say so yet, not until the file was finished, not until I could put proof on a table instead of a feeling. Jae-hoon was harder for me to read, those weeks. He never once wavered toward me, if anything. 14 months of restraint gave way to something raw, more protective. The ring from his mother now sitting in a small box on our bedroom dresser that he touched every single night before he turned off the light. But I watched the toll his family's pressure took on him. His grandmother had started, subtly at first and then not subtly at all, suggesting that perhaps the marriage had been hasty, that perhaps a man in his position needed a partner who understood the responsibilities of the name, that perhaps, and this one she said directly to him, in Korean, believing I didn't understand enough to follow, though I understood every word. Yuna had always been the more suitable choice, and it wasn't too late to correct course. I found him one night sitting alone in his study long after everyone else had gone to bed, his mother's ring turning over and over between his fingers. "They want me to end this," he said, without looking up. "My grandmother has said it 3 times this month, not directly. She's too careful for that, but I understand what she's building toward." "What did you tell her?" "That my mother pawned her wedding ring to survive a winter this family pretends never happened, and that I would rather be married to the woman whose grandmother kept it safe for 30 years than to anyone who spent 3 years lying about porcelain to impress a room." His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. I told her that. She didn't have a response for it. "You knew," I said quietly. About the pieces. He looked up then. I've known Yuna Bike since I was 9 years old, Naomi. I've watched her build an entire identity out of other people deciding not to check her math. I didn't know the specifics. I suspected the shape of it. His jaw tightened. I was waiting to see if you'd find it yourself, because I knew that if you did, you'd have something I never could prove nobody in this family could wave away as jealousy or spite. If I accused her, it's a husband defending his wife. If you prove it, it's an appraiser doing her job. Those are not the same weapon, and I needed you to be the one holding it. That's a lot to put on someone without telling them. I know. He didn't look away from it. I'd do it again. Not because I don't trust you, because the moment I told you what I suspected, it would have become my suspicion in your hands instead of your own discovery. And this family would have found a way to make that the story. A jealous husband and his convenient wife. I needed it to be undeniably, entirely yours. I understood the logic of it, even as some smaller, tireder part of me wished he'd simply said so months earlier. But I had built my own career on the same principle that proof carries a different weight depending on whose hands found it first, and I couldn't fault him for trusting me with the harder, lonelier version of the job. That was the moment I stopped debating whether to act and started planning how. The Choi Foundation's Winter Gala was, by design, the largest and most photographed event of the family's year 600 guests, a live auction broadcast to donors who couldn't attend in person. And this year, a headline lot that Yuna had spent 4 months promoting, a Joseon-era moon jar, allegedly recovered from the Choi family's ancestral home and donated by Choi So-yeon herself. Opening bid $200,000, proceeds to the foundation's education fund. Yuna had given 3 separate press interviews about it. She called it, in one of them, a piece of who we really are. 10 days before the Winter Gala, the foundation's coordinator called me, apologetic, to say that the guest list had been revised and that my invitation had somehow been left off the final printing. I didn't need to ask whose office that revision had come from. I called Jae-hoon, who made exactly 1 phone call of his own, and by that evening a corrected list had gone out with my name reinstated, and, I was told secondhand, a brief and extremely uncomfortable conversation had taken place between Jae-hoon and the events coordinator about whose authority it was to revise anything without his sign-off. Yuna never mentioned the guest list to me directly. She didn't have to. I understood it as exactly what it was, the last small move available to a woman who could feel, without yet knowing why, that the ground under her had already started to shift. The night before I filed the viewing request, I told Jae-hoon everything, not the outline this time, the whole file. 16 photographs. Marcus's notes. Auction records going back years. The exact wording I intended to use at the podium, because I had learned from watching Yuna operate for 14 months that a room believes whoever sounds the most certain. And I did not intend to leave my certainty to chance. He read through the file twice at the kitchen island, in the same seat where he'd sat with his mother's ring in his fist 3 months earlier, and when he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Once you do this," he said, "there's no undoing it. Not for her, not for my grandmother, not for how my family sees you. Some of them will never forgive you for being right. I know. I'm not asking you to stop." He closed the folder and set his hand flat on top of it, like he was steadying something. "I'm asking if you're ready for what it costs, because I watched my father spend 31 years protecting a story instead of a person, and I am not going to ask my wife to do the same thing for a family that's never once protected her. I've been ready since the ledger," I said. "I just needed to be right first. My grandmother didn't sell things people needed back. I'm not going to let this family sell a lie people needed to believe." He nodded once, the way he nodded at board meetings when a decision had actually been made, and reached for his phone to clear his schedule for the following evening. I requested, through the Foundation's events coordinator, a standard pre-auction viewing slot, the kind any accredited appraiser is entitled to request before a major lot goes to auction, a formality almost nobody exercises because almost nobody in that world is actually accredited to exercise it. Yuna didn't know I'd requested it. I made sure of that. I examined the moon jar on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in the Foundation's storage room, under proper daylight-balanced lighting, with my loupe and a UV lamp and 6 years of training that nobody at that gala had ever bothered to ask about. It took me under 4 minutes to confirm what I already suspected. The glaze crackling was too regular. The base showed wheel-throwing marks inconsistent with the period, and beneath the base, faint but unmistakable under UV light, was a maker's stamp, a contemporary Korean ceramics workshop still in operation today, one that specialized, according to their own public catalog, in museum-quality historical reproductions. I photographed everything. I documented everything, the way my grandmother taught me. Because someday somebody's dignity is going to depend on you having proof, and this time the somebody was me. And the dignity was every family Yuna had convinced to pledge real money against a lie. The night of the gala, I wore my grandmother's necklace on a new chain, sturdier this time, the ring at its center sitting exactly where it always had. Jae-hoon wore his mother's ring on a thin chain of his own, tucked beneath his collar, close to his heart, for the first time since he'd gotten it back. The auctioneer opened the bidding on the moon jar at $200,000. Hands went up around the room, fast, practiced. Yuna stood near the front in white this time, glowing, accepting quiet congratulations before the gavel had even fallen once, already being introduced by 2 board members as the woman who found it. I raised my hand not to bid, to speak. The auctioneer, momentarily thrown, paused the floor. "Before this lot goes any further," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, came out perfectly level. "I'd like to formally request, as an accredited appraiser, that the provenance documentation for this piece be reviewed on record. I have some concerns about its attribution. If a comment ever needed a single word instead of a sentence, it's this moment right here comment proof if you already know exactly where this is going." A ripple moved through the front rows. Yuna's smile didn't fully drop, not at first. "Naomi, this isn't really the venue for, it's exactly the venue," I said. 600 people are about to pledge real money based on a claim of authenticity. I think they deserve to know what they're actually bidding on. I turned to the auctioneer. "May I?" He looked, uncertain, toward Choi So-yeon, who sat very still in the second row and said nothing, which he correctly read as permission, because in that family silence from the matriarch had always meant proceed. I walked to the display stand. I put on a pair of cotton gloves. I turned the jar over, angled it toward the room's overhead lighting, and pointed to the base. "This crackling pattern," I said, loud enough to carry to the back tables, "is what's called reduction crackling, produced by a specific modern kiln process. Genuine Joseon-era celadon and porcelain crackle irregularly, over centuries, from age and handling not uniformly, the way this piece does, straight out of production." I clicked on the small UV lamp I'd brought and held it beneath the rim. A faint stamp glowed at the base, plainly visible now to anyone close enough to look. And this is a maker's mark from a ceramics workshop in Ikcheon that's been in continuous operation since 2003. I contacted them this week. They confirmed, in writing, that they produced this exact reproduction 18 months ago, on commission. That's not Yuna's voice cracked across the room, too loud, too fast. "You have no authority to make that determination in front of donors. This is exactly the kind of amateur overreach I warned the board about. I'm certified through the same accrediting body as the auction house handling tonight's lot," I said, and nodded toward the auctioneer, who, to his credit, had already pulled out his phone to verify it. "You can check my credentials right now, in front of everyone, the same way I checked this jar's. I'd invite you to do the same with yours." The room went very quiet. Somewhere behind me, a board member I didn't know murmured something to another about requesting Miss Bake's certifying body, the exact sentence I would learn later that ended up in the Foundation's incident report by Monday morning. I set the jar down, gently, and looked at Yuna directly for the first time all evening. It's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. It is not a Joseon-era moon jar, and it was never recovered from anyone's ancestral home. I don't think you made it. I think you bought it, knowing exactly what it was, because it photographs well, and nobody in this room was ever going to ask the question I just asked. The silence that followed made the one at the autumn gala look like polite applause. What happened over the following 6 weeks unfolded with a momentum I hadn't fully anticipated, though I understood, watching it, exactly why my grandmother had always said proof, once it's real, tends to keep multiplying on its own. The Foundation's board launched an emergency review of every piece Yuna had authenticated over 3 years. By the end of the first week, They'd found 16 more disputed attributions, spanning 11 years of gala history, representing an estimated $4. 7 million in inflated valuations pledged by donors who believed, in good faith, that they were funding education scholarships with genuine cultural treasures. 2 galleries and 1 major auction house that had informally endorsed Yuna's expertise over the years issued quiet statements distancing themselves from her, careful and lawyer-approved, the kind that never quite say the word fraud, but leave no doubt that everyone involved knows it applies. Her private client waitlist, once 11 names deep and quoted in a lifestyle magazine profile the year before, was empty within 9 days. The Foundation's insurer opened a formal audit that would ultimately run for the better part of a year, combing through a decade of acquisition records neither Yuna nor anyone else had ever expected to be checked. 3 donors requested and received refunds on prior year's pledges. A 4th, an elderly widow who had pledged $60,000 against the Celadon Bowl 3 years earlier, believing it would fund 4 education scholarships in her late husband's name, cried on the phone with the Foundation's new interim director and asked, simply, why nobody had checked sooner. Nobody had a good answer for her. I made sure, personally, that her scholarships were funded anyway, out of the Foundation's general reserve, before the audit had even finished, because some debts don't wait for paperwork. Choi So-yeon did not speak to Yuna again after the gala. Not because she was suddenly appalled by fraud, I don't believe. To this day, that fraud was ever the part that bothered her, but because Yuna's exposure had, in the same evening, exposed exactly how much Seo-yeon had known and chosen not to see, for exactly the reasons Jae-hoon had already guessed. A woman who fit the family's preferred story had turned out to be built on the same kind of lie the family had spent 31 years telling about itself. There was no way to distance herself from one without illuminating the other, and everyone in that ballroom who'd been paying attention understood it. So-yeon asked to see me alone, 4 days after the gala, in the same sitting room where she'd once told me I didn't understand what I'd married into. She looked smaller than she had at Christmas, older. "You embarrassed this family in front of 600 people, she said, without preamble. I told the truth in front of 600 people, I said. The embarrassment was already there. I just turned the lights on. She was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap. I knew, she said finally. Not the details. Not the 16 pieces. But I knew Yuna's confidence outran her expertise years ago, and I let it, because she made this family look the way I wanted it to look. And you, she started again. You have never once let this family look like anything other than exactly what it is. That's not an insult where I come from, I said. I'm aware. She almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but I saw where it would have landed. My son buried his mother's poverty so deep, he forgot he'd buried a person along with it. I helped him do it, because it was easier than grieving her, honestly. You dug up more truth in 4 months than this family managed in 31 years, and I don't know yet whether I'm angrier about the fraud or about how much easier this family could have been, all this time, if we'd just let ourselves be an honest one instead of an impressive one. I didn't have a response for that, so I didn't offer one. Some apologies don't need to be accepted to be heard. Yuna left the country 3 weeks later. I heard, second-hand, that she resettled somewhere with family who hadn't followed the story closely enough to ask questions. I don't know if that's true. I stopped keeping a file on her the day the Foundation's review confirmed the 16th piece, because by then the file had done everything I built it to do, and my grandmother never believed in holding on to things past the point they'd served their purpose. Jae-hoon had the ring reset 3 weeks after the Winter Gala, not replaced, not redesigned into something grander, just cleaned. The worn place on the inside of the band preserved exactly as it was, and set into a new chain alongside my grandmother's ring on the same length of gold. He didn't ask before he did it. He knew, by then, that some questions between us didn't need asking anymore. 2 women held on to something that mattered for 30 years each, without ever meeting, he said, fastening the clasp at the back of my neck himself, his hands steadier than they'd been the night he first recognized it. I'd like them to sit together from now on, if that's all right with you. It was more than all right. It felt, finally, like the story my grandmother had been writing in the margins of her ledgers the whole time, waiting for somebody to come back and read it correctly. Some things aren't really lost. They're just held by the right people until the moment they're needed, and then they hold you back. The foundation asked me, formally, 3 weeks after the Winter Gala, to take over as interim curatorial advisor while they restructured the role Yuna had left behind. I said yes on one condition, that every future placard in that archive would list not just a piece's origin, but the name of whoever had verified it, so that authority in that room would never again rest on nothing but a confident voice and an expensive dress. The board agreed without much debate. I suspect, by then, they'd had enough of finding out the expensive way what happens when nobody checks. Jaehoon's grandmother sent a card, a month later, congratulating us on the Foundation's successful transition to new curatorial leadership. No apology, no acknowledgement of anything else. I put it in the ledger drawer at the shop, next to a very old entry about a woman named Minna and $400, and a promise of no rush, because my grandmother taught me that some things are worth keeping on file, even after they've stopped hurting, not for proof anymore, by then, but simply so you remember, clearly, exactly how far you've come from the room where someone once tried to make you small. I still wear the necklace every day. 2 rings now instead of 1, sitting together on the same chain. One worn thin by a woman who pawned it to survive a winter. One appraised once at $400 by a woman too honest to inflate a number just because a client needed it to be bigger. Neither of them was ever the point. The point was always who kept them safe, and who tried to tear them away. And which of those 2 women a room full of strangers believed, when it finally came down to proof instead of performance.